The soft hum of morning chatter filled the diner, blending with the faint hiss of coffee machines and the clinking of cups. Sunlight streamed in through the tall glass windows, spilling over the polished wooden tables where groups of soldiers gathered after their morning drills. They came in with the energy of comradeship, their uniforms crisp, their laughter echoing the bond of men who had trained, fought, and bled together. The smell of fresh coffee, bacon, and buttered toast lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of leather jackets and polished boots. Colonel James Walker sat at a corner booth, his posture straight but not stiff, the kind of presence that naturally commanded respect without needing to raise a voice. His hair, once dark and thick, was now streaked with silver, and his face bore lines carved by years of service and countless sleepless nights. His eyes, a piercing blue, carried the weight of both authority and memory. Younger soldiers, seated with him, spoke with a mixture of ease and deference, laughing about barracks jokes one moment and turning serious when they mentioned deployments. Walker listened, nodding occasionally, his hand wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. But inside, his thoughts wandered. He wasn't hearing half of what the younger men were saying. Instead, his mind kept returning to fragments of the past. The dusty air of Afghanistan, the smell of gunpowder, the cries of civilians, and the endless sound of helicopters circling above battle-worn villages. He had lived long enough to know that war didn't end when the battle stopped. It lived inside you, lingering, heavy as a shadow you could never outrun. The bell above the diner door chimed, but Walker barely noticed. His gaze stayed fixed on the coffee swirling in his cup. He had made it a ritual, stirring the drink slowly, watching the whirlpool, using it as a distraction from the images that wanted to resurface. The laughter of the soldiers around him helped, but only slightly. He looked at them, strong, full of youth, eyes still bright with hope, and wondered if they realized how much life could change in one unexpected moment. "Sir," one of the soldiers, Lieutenant Harris, leaned forward, "what do you think about the new training rotations? They're saying we might be shipped earlier than expected." Walker took a slow sip before answering. "The schedule is only part of the job. What matters is preparation. If you're prepared, the when doesn't matter." The others nodded, taking his words like gospel. Harris smiled faintly, the kind of smile that showed admiration. To them, Walker was more than a commanding officer. He was a living example of survival, a man who had seen everything they feared and had returned to tell the tale. Just as Walker set his cup down, a waitress approached. She moved with practiced precision, balancing a tray with fresh cups of coffee. Her black vest was buttoned neatly over a crisp white shirt, and a small bow tie sat perfectly at her collar. Her dark hair was pulled tightly into a bun, not a strand out of place. She looked no different from the dozens of waitresses Walker had seen over the years, but there was something about her calm focus that caught his attention. She leaned forward slightly to place a fresh cup in front of him. The movement caused her sleeve to slide just a little above her wrist, and that was when Walker froze. Time seemed to stop. On her wrist, just barely visible, were faint scars, parallel lines, etched into her skin like memories unwilling to fade. They weren't random scratches or accidents. These were old wounds, healed but permanent, the kind of marks that carried a history, a story of survival. Walker's breath caught in his throat. His hand tightened around his cup. The chatter of the diner grew distant, muffled, as if he had been pulled into another world. His heart thudded heavily in his chest. He stared, unable to look away. The waitress, noticing his gaze, quickly tugged her sleeve back down. Her eyes flickered with unease, as if she had been caught with a secret she never wanted revealed. She placed the remaining cups on the table, forcing a polite smile, but her hands trembled just slightly. Walker's lips parted, his voice a whisper barely audible. "That scar, is it?" The soldiers at the table turned toward him, confused. "Sir," one of them asked, but Walker wasn't looking at them. His eyes were locked on the waitress. Memories surged forward, unbidden and sharp, like shards of glass. He was no longer in the diner. He was back in a village torn apart by fire and chaos, running through the smoke with a child in his arms. The child's wrist had been torn open, blood staining his scarf as he tied it desperately around her wound. Her cries had pierced through the explosions, through the chaos, and had stayed with him all these years. The waitress stiffened, her breath catching. She lowered her eyes, then turned quickly, as if to escape the weight of his stare. She moved to another table, forcing composure, but Walker could see the way her hands shook as she carried the tray. The diner's warm air suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. Walker leaned back, his mind spinning. Could it really be her? After all these years, after all the uncertainty, could this young woman be the child he had saved? He remembered every detail. The collapse of the building, the screams, the dust covering his uniform, the tiny body in his arms, the blood on his hands. He had never known what became of her. The medics had taken her away, and he had gone back into the fire to pull out more survivors. By the time he returned, she was gone, carried away in the chaos of evacuation. For years he had wondered. For years he had prayed she had lived. And now, here she was, in front of him, serving coffee in a quiet diner, the same scar etched into her wrist. Walker's hands trembled slightly as he reached into his wallet. He pulled out an old, faded photograph, one he carried with him always. The picture showed a small girl covered in dust, wide-eyed and terrified, her arm bandaged crudely with his scarf. It was the only image he had of that day, the only proof that his memory wasn't just a dream. He set the photograph on the table, staring at it, then lifted his eyes to the waitress again. She caught sight of the photo as she passed by, and her steps faltered. Her eyes widened, filling with tears. For a brief moment, her mask slipped, and raw emotion surfaced. She pressed her lips together, as if holding back a sob, and quickly looked away. Walker knew then. His heart ached with the weight of realization. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't imagination. The scar, the photograph, her reaction, it was her. The girl he had saved. But how could he tell her? How could he bridge the years of silence, the oceans of separation, the unspoken grief? His soldiers watched him curiously, sensing something significant was happening but not daring to ask. The diner around them continued its rhythm, but at their table, time had slowed. Walker whispered again, almost to himself, "It's really you." Walker's eyes stayed locked on the faint scars he had glimpsed beneath her sleeve. Every detail pulled him backward in time. He no longer saw the polished tables or the chatter of soldiers in the diner. Instead, his mind carried him 20 years into the past, to the barren landscapes of Afghanistan, where the sky was choked with smoke and the air reeked of blood and burning rubble. It had been one of the longest nights of his life. His unit had been deployed near a small village, their mission originally a simple patrol. But nothing was ever simple in a war zone. The ambush had come swiftly, the sound of gunfire cutting through the stillness of twilight. Walker remembered barking orders, pulling his men into defensive positions, watching as bullets ripped through walls and children screamed in the distance. Then came the explosion. The building had crumbled in an instant, the dust cloud so thick it blinded him. He remembered coughing, ears ringing, stumbling forward through smoke and debris. His boots crunched over shattered bricks and twisted metal. The cries pierced his heart more than the gunfire did, high-pitched, desperate cries, the sound of a child trapped under ruin. He found her beneath a collapsed beam, her small body curled, her arm bleeding heavily. Dust clung to her hair, and her dark eyes, wide with terror, met his. She had been no older than 8. Her lips quivered as she cried out in a language he barely understood, but the meaning was clear enough: "Help me." Without hesitation, Walker dropped his rifle to the ground, shoving rubble aside with his bare hands. The beam was heavy, cutting into his palms as he lifted, muscles screaming, but he would not let go. With a final grunt, he pulled it away and scooped her into his arms. She was trembling violently, blood running down her arm, soaking into his uniform. "It's all right," he whispered hoarsely, though he wasn't sure she understood. "I've got you. You're safe now." Her cries grew weaker, her head lolling against his chest. Panic surged through him. He pressed his scarf tightly against the wound on her wrist, tying it into a makeshift bandage. The fabric darkened quickly with blood, but it slowed the flow enough. He could feel her heartbeat fluttering, faint but present. Bullets cracked overhead, dust exploding near his feet as he sprinted out of the rubble, clutching her to him. His men shouted, covering him with suppressive fire, their eyes wide as they realized what he carried. He dove behind a wall, shielding the girl with his own body as debris rained down. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the sound of her breathing, shallow, uneven, and the determination pounding in his chest. He would not let her die here. He carried her to the medic station set up behind the line. The medics, young and overworked, rushed forward, their hands already pulling supplies. He laid her gently on the ground, brushing dust from her face. "She's critical," one of the medics muttered. "We'll do what we can." Walker knelt, refusing to move. He held her hand as they worked, whispering words of reassurance she could barely hear. Her eyes fluttered open once, just long enough to meet his. There was fear, yes, but also trust. The raw, desperate trust of someone who had been pulled from death's grip. "You'll make it," he promised her, his voice breaking. "I swear it." And then, as the medics stabilized her and prepared to evacuate civilians, Walker was pulled back to his duty. His men called for him, gunfire erupting again. He squeezed the girl's hand one last time, tucking the photograph someone had taken into his pocket, an image of her being treated, her tiny wrist wrapped in his bloodied scarf. When he returned hours later, she was gone. Evacuated. Saved, they said. But where? He never knew. The war pulled him forward, one mission bleeding into the next, until she became a memory he carried like a wound, always wondering, always hoping she had survived. Now, years later, in this quiet diner, he realized fate had brought her back. The sound of a tray clattering onto a counter snapped him back into the present. Walker blinked, his breath shaky. The waitress, no, the woman she had become, stood behind the counter, her back turned, shoulders trembling. She was trying to compose herself, but he could see the way her hands gripped the edge of the counter too tightly. He rose slowly from his seat, his soldiers glancing at one another with uncertainty. They could sense the weight of the moment but did not understand it. Walker's boots echoed softly on the tiled floor as he approached her. She turned at the sound, her eyes wide, tears glistening though she tried to hide them. For a moment, they just stared at each other, silence stretching, the diner around them fading into nothing. Finally, she whispered, her voice trembling, "Why do you have that picture?" Walker's hand trembled as he held out the faded photograph. "Because I was there," he said softly. "Because I carried you out." Her lips parted, a sharp gasp escaping. She covered her mouth with her hand, eyes filling. Her knees seemed to weaken, and she grabbed the counter for support. "It can't be," she whispered. "All these years, I thought he was gone. I thought I'd never see him again." Walker nodded slowly, his throat tight. "I never knew what happened to you. I prayed you survived. Every day, I wondered." The diner had fallen into a hush. The soldiers at Walker's table were watching, their faces a mixture of awe and confusion. A few other customers glanced curiously, sensing the significance of the exchange. The waitress, her name tag read Lena, finally found her voice. "I lost everything that day. My family, my home. But I survived. I was taken to a camp, then adopted years later. I built a new life here, but that day never left me. And neither did these scars." She pulled her sleeve back slightly, revealing the faint marks again. "I always remembered the soldier who carried me out. The scarf. The way he told me I'd make it." Walker's vision blurred as emotion overtook him. He reached out, hesitating only a second before gently taking her wrist, his fingers tracing the scars he once bandaged. His voice broke as he whispered, "And you did. You made it." She let out a sob, tears spilling freely now. The walls she had built for years crumbled in an instant. Without thinking, she stepped forward, and he opened his arms. She buried her face against his chest, shaking with emotion, and he held her tightly, as if afraid to ever let go again. The diner erupted in silence so deep it felt sacred. The younger soldiers looked away, giving their colonel privacy, though some wiped at their own eyes. Even strangers who had no idea of the full story felt the weight of it, their hearts moved by the reunion unfolding before them. For Walker, the years of guilt, the endless wondering, the sleepless nights replaying that explosion, suddenly, they had meaning. He hadn't saved everyone, but he had saved her. And seeing her alive, standing before him, was the redemption he hadn't known he needed. Lena pulled back slightly, her face wet with tears but glowing with relief. "All these years, I thought I'd never get the chance to thank you. You gave me my life back." Walker shook his head, voice raw. "No, you gave me mine. Knowing you survived, that's what I always needed to hear." Lena sat down at the edge of the booth, her hands still trembling, eyes red from the sudden rush of tears. The tray she had been carrying had long been abandoned on the counter, forgotten in the wake of what had just happened. Walker slid the faded photograph closer to her, as though placing it between them anchored the truth they had both just rediscovered. The other soldiers remained quiet, their respect palpable in the way they lowered their voices and sat straighter. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, slowly, Lena exhaled and began to tell her story. "When the medics took me that night," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I remember looking back for you. I didn't know your name, didn't even know if you were alive. But I remembered your voice. You told me I'd make it. Those words carried me through more than you'll ever know." Walker leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, every muscle taut with attention. "I was sent to a refugee camp," Lena continued. "It was crowded, filled with faces that looked as lost as I felt. I was alone. My parents, my brother, my home, all gone. For weeks, I survived on rations and strangers' kindness. But I kept repeating what you said. You'll make it." Sometimes I said it out loud, just to hear it again. She smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. "I guess it was the only thing that gave me hope." Walker swallowed hard. He wanted to reach across the table, to reassure her again, but he held himself still, letting her speak. "Eventually, I was adopted by a family here," she said. "A couple who couldn't have children of their own. They gave me a roof, food, schooling. They were kind, but I always felt different. Like I was carrying a story no one around me could understand. I worked hard, studied harder. I wanted to make something of this second chance you gave me. But no matter what I did, those scars reminded me every day where I came from." She pulled her sleeve back again, running her fingers gently over the faint lines. Her voice trembled. "I tried to hide them at first. Kids at school would stare, whisper. Some asked if I had hurt myself. I didn't know how to explain. So I wore long sleeves, even in the summer. But when I was alone at night, I would trace them and remember you. They were proof that I had been saved, proof that I hadn't imagined you." Walker's chest tightened, emotion swelling. The soldiers beside him looked shaken, their eyes darting between her and their colonel. None of them spoke, but the respect in their expressions deepened with every word she shared. "I never expected to see you again," Lena whispered. "When I came to work at this diner, I thought it was just another job. Just a way to keep moving forward. But when you saw me, when you pulled out that photo, it was like time folded back on itself. I'm that little girl, Colonel. I'm alive because of you." Her voice cracked on the last words, and Walker couldn't hold back any longer. He reached across the table, taking her hand firmly in his. His rough palm enveloped hers, steady and warm. I carried the weight of that day for 20 years, he said softly. Every night I thought of the ones I couldn't save. But you, seeing you here, it tells me it wasn't all for nothing. It tells me that at least one life I fought for found its way to hope again. That means more than you'll ever know. The diner had grown quieter as more patrons realized something profound was unfolding. A couple at a nearby booth exchanged looks, visibly moved. A young mother pulled her child closer, whispering softly. Even the cook leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching silently. The youngest soldier at Walker's table, barely out of training, cleared his throat. "Sir, this is..." He paused, struggling to find the words. "This is why we serve, isn't it?" Walker glanced at him, nodding slowly. "Yes, son, this is why." The soldier's eyes shone with a mix of pride and sorrow. He sat back, visibly shaken by the living proof before him that one act of courage could ripple through decades. Lena wiped her eyes, a faint smile breaking through her tears. "For years, I told myself that if I ever met the man who saved me, I'd thank him properly. But thank you feels so small for what you gave me. You gave me a future. You gave me the chance to grow up, to laugh, to cry, to live." Walker shook his head gently. "No, Lena, you gave yourself that. I just pulled you from the rubble. You carried yourself through the years after. You built the life. You chose to keep going." Her lips quivered. She squeezed his hand tightly, and for a moment they sat like that, locked in a silence more powerful than any words. Then one of the older veterans in the diner, who had been listening quietly from his table, stood up. He was frail, leaning on a cane, his jacket bearing patches from a war fought long before Walker's. He tapped the cane lightly and spoke, his voice gravelly but strong enough to carry. "I've seen my share of battles," the man said. "But let me tell you all something. What you're looking at right here, this reunion, this bond, that's the victory they don't write about in history books. Wars are ugly, they tear the world apart. But sometimes, out of the ashes, life finds a way to remind us why we fought at all." The diner fell into complete silence. Then, slowly, people began to nod. A few clapped softly, not the loud, raucous applause of a show, but the respectful, reverent kind that honored something sacred. Lena looked around, her cheeks flushing at the unexpected attention. She smiled faintly, embarrassed, but Walker placed a steady hand on her shoulder. His eyes carried the calm authority of a man who had weathered storms, and his presence shielded her from the weight of so many eyes. "Let them see," he murmured. "This is your story too." The applause faded, replaced by a hush that felt almost holy. For the rest of that morning, Lena stayed by their table, no longer the waitress serving coffee but the center of a story bigger than any of them had expected to witness. She spoke more about her journey, how she had worked through school, taken late shifts to support herself, and how every step forward had been fueled by the memory of the soldier who promised she would make it. The younger soldiers leaned forward, captivated. They asked gentle questions. What was it like to start over in a new country? How she found strength when everything had been taken. Lena answered with honesty, sometimes pausing when the memories grew too heavy, sometimes smiling through tears as she recalled small victories. Her first day of school in America, the first time she earned her own paycheck, the moment she realized she was no longer just surviving but living. Through it all, Walker listened, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He realized he had carried the guilt of that war for so long that he had forgotten there could be light on the other side of sacrifice. And now, seeing it embodied in her, he felt something in him begin to heal. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, its golden light spilling through the diner's glass windows. Hours had passed since Walker first noticed the scar, yet neither he nor Lena seemed aware of time. They sat together, still hand in hand, surrounded by soldiers who had fallen silent out of reverence. The other customers, once strangers, had become witnesses to something rare and unforgettable. Finally, one of Walker's men, Sergeant Davis spoke. His voice carried a mix of admiration and humility. "Sir, I've heard stories about heroes my whole life, but I've never seen one sit across from the life they saved. This is something I'll never forget." Walker looked at him, the corners of his mouth lifting into a faint, bittersweet smile. "Heroes are just men who refuse to look away when someone needs help. That's all." But Lena shook her head firmly. "No, it's more than that. You didn't just refuse to look away. You risked your life. You could have kept running. You could have stayed behind cover. But you didn't. You chose me, a little girl you didn't even know. That choice changed everything." Her words seemed to echo through the diner, sinking into everyone's hearts. The young recruits exchanged glances, their expressions solemn. They were learning a lesson no manual could ever teach them. Walker felt a lump rise in his throat. For years he had questioned whether his sacrifices had meant anything, whether the blood spilled and the lives lost had been in vain. But now, here was proof, living, breathing proof, that even in war's chaos, goodness could take root and endure. "Lena," he said softly, "I've carried many scars too. Most of them aren't on my skin. But seeing you here, it heals something in me I thought was broken forever." Her eyes filled again, but this time the tears were gentler, born not of pain but of release. "And seeing you heals something in me too. I don't feel like that lost little girl anymore. I feel whole." At that, Sergeant Davis stood abruptly and snapped to attention. The others followed, their boots thudding on the diner's floor. Without a word, they saluted their colonel, but more than that, they saluted the bond between him and Lena, the living testament of sacrifice and survival. The gesture took Walker by surprise. His chest swelled, his eyes burning as he slowly rose from his seat and returned their salute. Then he turned and looked at Lena. "This salute is for you too," he said quietly. Her hand flew to her mouth, overwhelmed. She had never been saluted before, never been honored in such a way. The soldiers lowered their arms, but the respect in their eyes remained unwavering. Word of the reunion spread quickly through the small town. By evening, the story had traveled beyond the diner walls. People came not out of curiosity but to offer quiet support. Some brought flowers. Others left handwritten notes thanking Walker for his service and Lena for her courage. The diner's owner placed the faded photograph in a frame on the wall, a permanent reminder of the day fate had brought two souls back together. In the weeks that followed, Lena was no longer just the quiet waitress with hidden scars. She became a cherished part of the military community. The soldiers invited her to events, shared meals with her, and listened when she spoke of resilience and hope. She, in turn, brought them warmth and perspective, reminding them why they served. For Walker, the change was even deeper. He had always carried himself with dignity, but there had been a heaviness in him, a burden of memories that had never left. Now, that weight lifted little by little each day. He found himself smiling more, laughing even. At night, when the memories came, they were no longer only of loss. They were of Lena's face, alive and strong, proof that at least one life had been spared and flourished. One evening, months after that morning in the diner, Walker and Lena stood side by side at a small ceremony on the base. The flag rippled in the breeze, the bugle played softly, and soldiers stood in formation. Walker had been asked to speak, but before he did, he placed a hand on Lena's shoulder and drew her forward. "This young woman," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "reminds us what service truly means. It isn't about medals or recognition. It's about the lives touched, the futures saved. I carried her once, years ago, out of rubble and fire. Today, she carries me, she carries all of us, reminding us why we endure, why we sacrifice." The soldiers erupted in applause, and Lena stood with tears in her eyes, humbled but proud. In that moment, she was no longer just the survivor of a war-torn childhood. She was a symbol of resilience, of the enduring power of kindness. As the ceremony ended, Walker turned to her, his voice low enough for only her to hear. I told you once you'd make it. Now I know. You were meant to. She smiled through her tears. And you were meant to find me again. The two stood together as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Around them, soldiers, families, and townsfolk lingered, their hearts lifted by the bond they had witnessed. And though neither Walker nor Lena could rewrite the tragedies of the past, they had found something just as powerful. Proof that even in the darkest of places, a single act of courage could ignite a chain of hope that lasted a lifetime. The end.